The media blames Trump for someone mishearing the president. We have updates on the negotiations to get a Senate bill, a congressional rescue package passed. And then what is the latest on New York's attempt to get ahead of the massive spike in COVID-19 cases? That and more coming up on the Buck Sexton Show.
In the coming weeks, in fact, we want to make it even better than it was before, and we're doing things to help in that regard. America will again and soon be open for business, very soon, a lot sooner than 3 or 4 months that somebody was suggesting, a lot sooner. We cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. We're not going to let the cure be worse than the problem. At the end of the 15-day period, we'll make a decision as to which way we want to go, where we want to go, the timing, and essentially we're referring to the timing of the opening, essentially the opening of our country.
Welcome to the Buck Sexton Show, everybody. We are in week 2 of the real quarantine effort here in the country, and we're in the second phase of the 15 days to slow the spread, and already we're seeing politics take over here. We have the fighting on Capitol Hill underway after Nancy Pelosi's 11th hour effort to just hold people hostage. And you are seeing not just partisan divides here, but class divides. You're seeing people who very clearly still get a paycheck, working from home, still feel like their business is relatively sound, and they can weather 3 months indoors, 6 months indoors. And there's a real effort underway for those people, it seems, to shout down anybody who raises the prospect of what happens when people that can't pay their bills can't pay their bills. Meaning, what happens when all of a sudden the rent checks don't clear, when you're running up credit card debt, or maybe you don't have a credit card, and now how do you get groceries without the checks coming in? That's the reality for millions and millions of people right now. But for those for whom that is not the reality, there seems to be a very dismissive and really nasty sneering that goes on. Oh, do you want people to die, they say? Do you just want people to expire? What about your parents or grandparents if you're not in the high-risk category? This is what you're hearing from the left. And to this I say, God, I would like it if we could have a real discussion in this country about what the acceptable policy risks are from different approaches. Now, let's understand this. When the president talks about trade-offs, as he did yesterday, when he says, let's not let this be worse than the disease, the trade-off here is acceptable risk versus, acceptable risk from the virus versus acceptable risk to the economy. There is a balancing act going on here. These two things are both important. And at some stage, at some phase of this, there will be states and or the federal government that lessen some of these restrictions. And in response to the lessening of those restrictions, there is a probability, not a certainty, but a probability that there could be more cases than there would have been under continued restriction. And if those restrictions are lifted and they're to some degree, I'm not talking about we just go back to life as normal. But if you lift any of those restrictions, there's more cases. And some of those cases require hospitalization. And some of those hospitalizations end up in someone dying from this terrible scourge. Are we then going to turn around and say that the government is guilty of murder? Is that, because that seems to be the position that I'm hearing from a lot of those on the left. This formulation that has appeared, not just among Democrats, there are Republicans too, that you don't care. The quote here that I'm seeing, paraphrase, but this is the basic talking point. If you don't agree that an endless shutdown is completely acceptable until the risks of this have dissipated to the point where, I don't know, no one has really established that. You don't care about your parents or your grandparents dying from this. All you care about is your 401k. That's what I keep seeing, which is a horrible thing to say to anybody. But let's keep in mind that, it has been an article of faith for years that people who don't believe in climate change catastrophism are are just not interested in the planet's survival, and they don't care that future generations will be living in this. This is the climate catastrophist position. They'll be living in this end of world, end of day scenario where the hots are hotter, the wets are wetter, storm systems, all the terrible things we're always told about, massive flooding and everything else. We don't care about that because we just are so mean. It's not that we just disagree on whether the risk of that happening is worth the massive and clear trade-offs now. We get into this discussion as a society all the time, and the president mentioned this yesterday in his press conference. He talked about how if we were to take the position that is now gaining a lot of supporters, particularly on the Democrat side, and I'll get into the very obvious politics of all this too, but right now this is more the emotional response you get from anybody, not just on the left. There are some on the right that I see that have decided this is the appropriate response as well. If you say that there is acceptable risk from a lessening of these restrictions in a matter of weeks, not months, and that acceptable risk will entail the possibility of further infection in some areas than would have occurred with maximum shutdown, because we cannot actually allow the economy to die entirely. If you say that, you're advocating for death. That's what the position is of many on the left. And the president yesterday was speaking about not letting this become worse than the disease, because I think he recognizes what the real consequences would be of a complete collapse of the U.S. economy. And we also live in a society where there are trade-offs that are made all the time. I would look very foolish. It would be a very bizarre position to take that we have to have, forget about a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, let's make it 10 or 15. Then cars could hit people, and it's very unlikely they'd die. You get really hurt, but most people would be able, usually survivability from being hit by a car, I forget the exact numbers, but if it's under 25 miles an hour, you're likely to survive. If it's over, I think it's 30 or 35 miles an hour, you're very likely to not survive. So we could just make the speed limit 15 miles an hour, and we would save tens of thousands of lives every single year. But no one really takes seriously that that's what we should do, even though, and the president brought this up in his speech, even though it is just a fact, it is a statistical certainty that if you made the speed limit, and now I know people would say, well, there'd still be some speeding and some, right, but if you enforce this and this became the speed limit, you would save easily thousands and thousands of lives every year. We understand that there are policy trade-offs that are made. There's acceptable versus unacceptable risk. We try to save every life, but trying to give everybody absolute protection, you cannot live your life in a bubble, or you won't have much of a life that you're leading in the first place. Now, that's not to say that I don't think we should take extreme measures to protect vulnerable populations and seniors. I absolutely think that that's what should happen right now. But there is a very real discussion that should be underway about how quickly we return to work with precautions in place and what level of risk, not just to vulnerable populations. Look, people can get this, healthy people can get this and be in very bad shape, and healthy people can get this and they can die from it. That is reality. What is acceptable risk in order to make sure the economy keeps going so that we can have food and ventilators and medical staff and masks, and all these things rely on an economy. Just staying absolutely in place and shut down indefinitely would have effects where you wouldn't really be able to even fight the disease the way that we currently are fighting it over time. And I'm just seeing that the viciousness and the insanity of people on the left in particular, when anyone in good faith tries to approach this topic. Right now they're saying Trump is putting profits over lives. It's as predictable as anything that you could ever see. Meanwhile, he's making the case that we all know this is reality. How many people, you get yelled at now if you bring up the flu. Why can't we have a discussion? This is based on CDC data, and this is at a point in time where, and by the way, I'm here in New York City, in the middle of the city, in the place that is by far the scariest to be right now, arguably outside of Italy in the world for coronavirus. And I'm dealing with these precautions all the time. I'm getting very scary notices from my building about, different things that we have to now not do or that we have to change. I'm seeing this all the time. I'm concerned about family members and loved ones here, especially those who are in the vulnerable population. I'm doing things day to day to help them out. But I also understand that we need to have a discussion about how long this lasts, because there are politicians who are going around saying might be 3 months, might be 6 months, might be 9 months. Now, 3 or 6 or 9 months of dealing with the virus in some capacity, yeah, that's to be expected. 3 to 6 months of shutdown, no businesses operating? Is that even really, first of all, I mean, is it feasible, as in will people comply with it? I think you'll have mass non-compliance. But at some point you ask the question, okay, if we think that it will decrease infections by overall, or it'll lessen the spread of the infections by, who knows, 20, 30% if we stay in this quarantine state, versus if we do some version of measures in place to protect us, but also business begins to operate. Is that now unthinkable? Because then I want to know why, when we look at the flu data, which shows you that for the last, and I just looked at it today, they estimate 25 to about 60,000 people in America have died from the flu from September of 2019 to present, to March. That's what the estimate says. So you could have upwards of 6, and by the way, it's likely to be at the higher end of that estimate, given how many times people, how often people would die from this, and they don't catch it on the autopsy. They don't know. There's also comorbidity that's involved. There can be multiple viruses that infect a person. Bacterial infection if you die from a bacterial infection of the lungs, but you had the pneumonia was induced by the flu, how does this all get quantified, and how do they catch it? So I would like to know why we're such a heartless society that we didn't shut down entirely. Remember, the standard we're being held to is if you think there's such a thing as acceptable risk. That's not the same. This isn't the same thing as sending people off to an island to die somewhere in quarantine. That's not what anyone's talking about. But acceptable risk parameters, if you don't believe in that, I need to know then why we don't shut down all business from September until March every year to prevent 30, 40, 50,000 flu deaths in this country. Well, are people heartless that don't want to shut down that way? See, this is a kind of moral grandstanding and blackmailing that occurs when there's an effort to have a real discussion about, okay, what are we really trying to accomplish here? How long can we sustain this? And what is acceptable risk? Risk of hospitalization, risk of casualties from hospitalization. That is the discussion. Now, Cuomo, I saw him this morning. There are others who are talking about this, and they're promising that we can do both. We can have smart policy on healthcare and restart the economy. I think that if you're just going to call it smart, sure, we can do both. But let's understand that there will be risk. This is a fact. And I know everyone's freaking out and yelling about this. There will be additional risk from opening up any business, any economy, any business activity. There is inherently additional risk in that situation versus a continued mandated lockdown quarantine circumstance. And with additional risk comes the possibility of, the likelihood of, some bad things happening. Are we willing to accept some change in those risk calculations? That's the discussion. It's not, people don't care if grandma dies as long as their 401k goes up. That's horrific. It's intellectually dishonest. It's really grotesque, actually. And they're accusing people on the other side who are saying, okay, can we have a conversation here about how long does this last? How long do we do this? I mean, I could sit around and just say, yeah, mandatory lockdown, at least 3 months, no business, nothing. No one gets to go to work unless they can work from home, but no other businesses can open. Because I'm such a good person, that's what I think needs to happen. And at 60 days, if any state decides, or if anyone's advocating for some lessening of those restrictions, and then there's any spike at all in infections and hospitalizations that occurs from that, I'll say, these people they're clearly murderers. That is what is being put out there right now. That's the discussion. And it's disconcerting because we need to be having adult, sober, serious conversations among people we're all affected by this. This affects everyone. Just shut up, listen to the epidemiologists. I'll listen to epidemiologists about the risks from this, washing my hands. I'm not putting epidemiologists in charge of America for the next 6 months. And that's what I think the left does not really gather here. That's what they're missing. And it's not helpful to anyone to pretend that there are people in this debate who don't care if their loved ones die as long as they see their stocks rebound. I don't even care about stock. I don't even own enough stock to care about it. This is an abomination in this debate to even say these things. But this is now the line. There's a moral blackmail that's going on because people want it their way. And if you don't agree with them, you're a bad, terrible person who doesn't care. I mean, this is, throw Granny off a cliff all over again, like back in the Obamacare days. If you disagree with the policy, you're saying people should die. This is what they do. This is what they're saying. Meanwhile, there are very real and mounting concerns about what the long-term economic damage of the current situation will be. And the president is out there saying that we need to take this into account. He's talking to his experts all day. But if you bring this up, be prepared. The virtue signaling left will come after you and suggest that there's a way that we can just restart the economy and no additional risk from this. No additional risk from the virus, even when we restart the economy. I would like to see what that plan is. I'd like to see how it looks. And I could stand on the sidelines and be an irresponsible jerk. And the moment that anyone tries to get the economy started, just say, see, you don't care. People over profits. Why don't you care about the dead people? We all care about the dead people. We all wish that our fellow Americans didn't have to go through this, and we don't want a single person to be hospitalized, to lose their life to this. We're all working to the same goal. And those who insist on pretending we're not are acting in bad faith, and they're being bad people right now at a time when the country is in a true crisis.
I am confident that the president has listened to and seen all of our data as it evolves. I think you can see that the president over these 3 weeks has been very focused on what the American people need, both economically and public health-wise. And I think it's incumbent on every public health official to be looking at their data in a very granular way to understand who's at risk of hospitalization, who's at risk of mortality, how do we stop the spread, and really move to a 21st century supercomputing approach rather than a more generic slide rule-based approach.
The president's listening. Everyone's crunching the data. The president is listening. This is not the message that you would get from the media, however. This is not what they want you to think. They are invested in a narrative, and you are seeing the return of the ugliest politics of the left and the Democrat Party this week, not just over the stalling of the rescue bill, which we know is completely a Democrat ploy. This is underhanded, dirty pool from the Democrats. There's no question about that. Anyone who says otherwise is just being unserious. And we also see that the anti-Trumpism behind much of the criticism that was in the early days of this has returned now. And there's not just a population that is in fear, but there's a population that has been trained to hate this president. And now they're also scared, and they want to crush anybody who disagrees with anything they're saying right now.
Well, if you put the economy ahead of public health, and then you have people dropping like flies from the pandemic, you're going to ruin the economy anyway. There's no choice about this. It's got to lean toward public health. We have to tamp down the pandemic, as Sanjay said. We're 2 weeks behind where the virus is. So when the president starts talking about we're going to open up for business, not only are we arguing about, are we going to wait 15 days and then go back to normal, he's undermining the efforts to keep people socially distant now, because what they hear is, well, we got to open up the economy, or maybe the social distancing doesn't matter so much. So morally, it's public health over the economy in the short run.
Okay, a lot to unpack here. This is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. See, everyone who's intelligent and being serious recognizes that there is a balance here, right? And that we don't shut down because of flu, because it would be considered more damaging to all of us in the aggregate And so we just have come to recognize that there is a likelihood, not a certainty, but a likelihood of large numbers of people dying from the flu every year. Society makes these. We absolutely could go into quarantine and that would save lives from flu. We absolutely, but we don't. And no one sits around saying, why don't we go into total quarantine? Okay, COVID-19 is different. We're trying to stop the spike. We're trying to get ahead of this. I understand what the arguments are, and that's why I have been advocating for 15 days the government's way. Let's let them move. I watched the press conference with Governor Cuomo this morning. Remember, New York is on the absolute front line here, New York City in particular, where I'm doing this show right now. We have by far the most. We have like 20,000 cases. The next closest is California, is around 2,000-ish. So we're 10x. And I have tons of friends here, people that, I have family members that I love. I have dear friends of mine for decades who are well into the high risk category. And I think we should do everything that we absolutely can to protect those individuals. But there is also a discussion here about how long all of us, meaning everyone, has to be on lockdown, including those who are willing to take, remember, it's all about risk tolerance. Younger people are at lower risk, not no risk, lower risk of dying from this disease or even being hospitalized and being ventilated. So, okay, when do we get to start lessening some of the restrictions? See, the way this guy said it, go back to normal. That's not the argument that's being made. It's, are we willing to accept a slightly elevated risk? And people who tell you there's not an elevated risk, oh, you want people to die, they're idiots. Clearly, the moment you lessen some of these, unless the plan, and maybe some people think this is the plan, is to wait until there are no cases whatsoever. And everyone's saying this might be endemic, meaning within the population. This might be endemic for at least the next 18 months before we get a vaccine. Let's hope it works, by the way. If you think you're going to sit around and wait for that vaccine, they might say, yeah, we tried, we have these trials, but this disease mutates very quickly and we don't have any, yeah, that's a possibility too. So are we just going to sit in maximum quarantine? Am I a better person because I say, I don't care how many people, if I took the position, I don't care how many people lose their livelihoods, lose their ability to pay their bills. I don't care how much businesses absolutely collapse. Boeing, my friends, major American corporations are on their knees. The airline industry is about to die. Now, for those of you who say, oh, well, whatever, creative destruction, capitalism, when we get through this, if there are no airlines, guess what? We're going to have a whole problem for commerce, business, individual travel for leisure, and what that does to the economy as well. It's going to be gone. This is not normal economic stuff. This is not just, oh, we're in a downturn. This is a shutdown, right? So we can either accept that there are going to be elevated risk parameters here, or we can do what I was saying a moment ago, which, when I say accept, have a discussion, a public discussion. Everyone's affected by this. Everyone's involved. What is feasible? What is not? The health experts say this is acceptable, tolerable risk. And then the policymakers say, all right, we're going to go forward with that. But people who are telling you that it's just about putting public health first, this is a slogan. Okay, well, what does that mean? For how long? Well, of course, we're putting it first. That's why we've shut down the economy. But am I a better person? Am I a more moral person if I say, let's just shut the economy down totally? Because I want an absolute maximum protection. I'm not willing to accept any additional risk. Remember, risk does equal greater hospitalizations, not a free-for-all that we don't do anything. Greater hospitalizations, and with hospitalizations will come some loss of life. This is reality. No one speaks about it in these terms because it feels uncomfortable to. But I want someone to explain to me how that's not the case. Risk will equal hospitalizations, will equal people dying from this. All the calculations we're looking at are about mortality and about percentage of the population. Am I a better person if I say, I just think we should be on total quarantine, total lockdown, no business whatsoever until this time next year, 12 months? Would I be a better person if I told anybody that questioned that? I'm sorry, you just don't care if people die. You don't care if people die, huh? But this is the way the narrative is trending right now. You don't care about death if you want to have a discussion about the very real impact on human beings from a Great Depression Part 2 versus acceptable risk with preventative measures in place to protect vulnerable populations, but getting the beginning of the economy going. This is what the president's saying. He talked about trade-offs last night in a speech, and I knew this would happen. Trade-offs last night when, as soon as he says this, people are saying, see, he doesn't care about death. It's profits over people's lives. It's what everyone's saying. You can't put a price on human life. You hear this. And I know that feels good. It sounds good. And it's true as a moral principle. Is it true as an organizing principle for society? Because if you can't put a price on human life, well, first of all, that the Democrats in the abortion lobby, I mean, don't even get me started on that. But if you can't put a price on human life, then that principle must be adhered to with regard to yearly flu preparations. We must shut down massively across the country. Otherwise, we're going to lose 40 or 50,000 people every year. Why? Someone explain the moral differentiation between those, that exists in those positions. And they can't. But look, I understand. You have this storm right now of very real fear, very real concern, justifiable fear and concern. I'm worried. I'm worried about family members. I'm worried about myself. And I'm here in the midst. I know a lot of you who listen to this show, and I love all of you across the country, and I'm so appreciative that you are still with me and still joining me as I'm doing this show in the midst of this pandemic, every day. A lot of you are in places where the risk is far more remote. And you're allowed to feel like there's a different risk tolerance for you, for your family, and that may be reflected in the way your state deals with this too. Right? To think that there needs to be a one-size-fits-all approach. China locked down, not that we should do what China did, they were soldering people into their homes, but China locked down Wuhan City and Hubei province, didn't lock down the entire country to the same degree, though. So even the most extreme in terms of response to this, there was differentiation within the same country. So that means that when we look at this now, we need to accept that those of you who I saw some of you writing in from KLBJ Austin. I want to get to Austin so badly, and now of course I can't even travel, can't go anywhere. KLBJ Austin, Austin has had a shutdown. They're now at the more extreme end of the preparations spectrum here. Other cities across the country. I know obviously KEIB, folks listening out there in Los Angeles, LA is very much under lockdown. Gavin Newsom is taking the approach. He's like, look, this might be 3 months. All right, well, can we have a conversation about that? What do we need the numbers to look like? Because unless someone's going to tell me that if the numbers have to be zero, at least they can be consistent. But then they're willing to say economic catastrophe and destruction is completely acceptable until we have zero spread, zero cases, zero deaths from this. We might be waiting for that for years, but at least that's a consistent position. Any other position is built in with the inherent assumption. There is an inherent assumption of some risk, and that means risk of death. Now, I understand, and this is where I'm trying to be walking a little bit of a tightrope here, because how we talk about this does matter, and I get that. And it can sound callous when you're discussing mortality rates. And this is true just of the medical profession, I think. Generally, when people are discussing, this is true when you look at the risk of any pharmaceutical drug. This is true of the risk of taking Advil, the risk of taking Tylenol. You can die from that. You can have stomach bleeding. It can happen. The reason why we have, every time you watch any commercial for a pharmaceutical, take like blah, blah, blah. And it'll, and the people are all horseback riding and they're all laughing in the sunshine. And they're like, could cause, heart attack, anal leakage, all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, you've got all these scary, bad things that happen. And you say, okay, well, does that mean no one should take the drug? And does that mean the pharmaceutical companies are murderers? Because some tiny percentage of people might have really serious complications leading to death? Should we ban those pharmaceuticals from the stores? It's time for us to start having a real philosophical understanding of what's going on here, because our civil liberties are at risk. The Constitution is at risk. Pelosi, the Democrats, are ruthless with the power grab that's going on Capitol Hill right now. The anti-Trump movement sees this as their best opportunity, not just to put a Democrat in the White House in 2020, but to destroy Trump and Trumpism and drag every Trump supporter they can for as long as they can. Just rake them across the coals. That's all also in this discussion now. It was last week a little bit more about how we keep each other safe and sound. And now it's turned into Orange Man bad. And if you think the economy should be opened up and are willing to accept some additional risk, you're a murderer who only cares about your 401k. This is a horrifically vicious, stupid, dishonest way to have the conversation right now. But people are scared. Demagogues are all over the place, and they want payback for 3 years of lying about Trump, being wrong about the crises he was throwing us into. Now we see what a crisis is. There were no crises with Donald Trump the first 3 years worthy of the kind of freak out that the media had. This is a crisis. And they're using every trick they have, every tool they have at their disposal to dump all of it, not just on Trump. Remember that. It's going to be Trump supporters, too. Anybody that's thought this administration was doing a good job before, you are going to be made to stare at the body count and say, see, your guy did this. Even though the UK and Italy and Germany and Spain and China, all these countries that apparently don't have leaders as horrible as Donald Trump, have been absolutely wrecked by this. But we're going to be told that it was all Trump's fault, and they're preparing that assault. I shouldn't say they're even preparing. There's an ongoing narrative thread here that they need to keep that in place. And that, unfortunately, is also making this a much nastier, more acrimonious discussion than it needs to be. Just for the record, so that, when Media Matters or one of these other organizations that came after me for what I was saying yesterday, when I'm going on the record, I want the maximum protection of human life possible across the board. And I want a serious discussion about what is acceptable risk for society to tolerate when it comes to our response to this, the timelines for this, and trying to protect all of us, including our ability to sustain our society while we're dealing with this pandemic. But I want maximum protection for everybody. Every life is precious. And I have to tell you, I would put... Anyway, I started to get a little bit too fired up about this. I want to say, any of these libs that are making this argument, this conversation about their moral superiority, it's amazing how much I see them and recognize they're not even good people before this. They're not kind, decent human beings absent, before this pandemic even happened. Now, though, they're the ones who really care. Sure.
It's not a question of if the economic shutdown is absolutely brutal for Americans, for our fellow citizens, for our economy. Of course it is. It's just that those on the right in the business world talking to Donald Trump are just misreading what the choices are right now. There is no option to just let everyone go back out and go back to normal if a pandemic rages across the country and infects 50% of the population and kills a percentage point at the low end of those infected and also melts down all the hospitals. What kind of economy do you think you're going to have under those conditions? As the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom orders a countrywide lockdown for the next 3 weeks, after resisting the idea, the President of the United States appears to be just considering the opposite. Okay, enough of that. Let's take our chances with the virus.
That's a false choice. There's no one who's advocating for let's just pretend this isn't a problem and go back to normal. But what do these liberals, and by the way, Chris Hayes, I'm sure, at MSNBC hasn't missed a paycheck, lives in a very fancy, probably a brownstone, I would guess, in Brooklyn, multi-million-dollar home, certainly, and he has not missed a paycheck. He's not worried about any of this. In fact, his viewership has probably gone up. what does he say to the families of people who have been told you cannot go to work, your job is not allowed, the state is mandating you cannot do your job, you cannot go back to being a welder, you cannot go back to being a plumber, you cannot do these things right now, and you have no money in the bank, but the government's going to show up with a check for you soon. Well, how much psychological pressure and stress do we think we keep these people under? And what is the real benefit? The virus is still spreading, folks, even with these measures in place. So it's not like we've got this beat, and if we just keep doing what we're doing, we're going to be fine. Quite the opposite. As we see, the virus is spreading very, very rapidly. So if there's a way to put the economy back in action that doesn't create a dramatic spike in infections and hospitalizations, is that worthy of conversation? No, but instead he's saying, I don't even know where he got this number. 50%. Producer Mark, did he say 50% will die or will be infected?
I think infected.
Infected. 50% infected. Then the numbers of people that are supposed to be that'll be infected with this based on those projections, it's over 3 cycles, as Dr. Birx has told us. So that would mean if we dealt with this for 18 months.